And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God.
The revelation of Jesus Christ.
Happy with the way I finished up last Sunday evening, and so I decided to revisit that. What I did was to cut that out of the video when I put it out. And for the sake of those who only get the videos, I need to cover the territory again, but I'm going to do it in a totally different way. So back at Revelation 13:10, if you have an ear to hear, listen up. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and faith of the saints. So we talked about the fact that saints have an ear to hear, and it's addressed to the saints. They've had their understanding opened when they were born again. Holy Spirit has enlightened them. And then verse 10 is a fitting message for the saints. It's a word of direction for future saints. If you're destined for captivity, you will go into captivity. If you're destined for the sword, you will be killed by the sword. And this is the perseverance of the saints. Saints are identified by perseverance. If you are saved, you're going to persevere. That's eternal security. You will not lose your salvation. You will not depart from the things that you have believed if you are born again. And even in the great tribulations, saints will persevere. It's going to be terrible. I mean, this is talking about you can be thrown in prison, you can be killed, and it's going to happen. Don't expect to be delivered. Expect it to happen. And you will persevere, and they will. So the beast will put them in prison, the beast will kill them, and the saints will persevere. Now, the differences in interpretation we talked about last time are largely the result of different translations that we have. The King James of the first half of the verse reads like this: "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity." He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. So if you take somebody and make them a prisoner, you're going to be made a prisoner yourself. And that's not addressed to the saints, that's addressed to the beast. That would be those who are doing the persecuting. If you're working with a beast, if you're putting people in prison, then you're going to be put into prison yourself. But the New American Standard at this point reads, "If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity goes." That's entirely different. Whether you lead into captivity or you're destined for captivity. Are you going to be the aggressor or are you going to be the victim? One translation is one way and the other translation is the other way. And of course that's talking to saints. If you're destined to captivity, then you'll go into prison. And these variations are based upon different Greek texts. They're not just differences in an English translation. They are translating different Greek words. They are taking it from different manuscripts and translating what they found in the manuscripts. And I'm going to show you the Greek just as if that were, let's see, inspirational. But I'll show it to you in a little bit. The Greek text that King James was based on has a present active verb, and the Greek text the New American Standard is based on has a passive infinitive. Present active, present, flow of thought, and it's an indicative. It is this is just a statement. But the Greek text that the NASB is based on is a passive infinitive. It's passive. It's something that's happening to them, not something they're doing. Active versus passive. Active, if you're throwing people in jail. Passive, if you're destined for jail. And it's a difference between a present and an infinitive. Infinitive is to do something. Usually you put to in front of a word, and it's the infinitive form. So let's talk a little bit about why there are different manuscripts. We have vastly more manuscripts of the Scriptures, particularly here, New Testament, than of any other ancient document, where you might have one or two copies of, say, the writings of Aristotle. You've got thousands of copies of the New Testament written in Greek and very ancient. We're talking about those copies that are before the invention of the printing press. And with all those thousands of manuscripts, we do not have a single manuscript that has the entire original text. In other words, you couldn't go somewhere and say, okay, here's this Greek manuscript, and this is exactly the way that it was given. This is the original. This is the text. Not surprisingly, during the first 200 years, many, many manuscripts were destroyed because Rome hated the church. They said, these folks don't worship the gods. They're ungodly. And it's because we, the Christians, were not worshiping their gods. So they looked at us as being pagan. To them, Christians were pagan. And so the best thing to do with the Christian scriptures was to get rid of them. Now, I would look at that and say Satan was behind this. Satan has been trying to destroy things. We've been looking at this in chapter 12 and now in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation. He was eager to get rid of these things. And so now we've got a New Testament, and if you can get rid of all the copies of that, then this thing will die out. We won't have a problem with that. So libraries were burned. Churches were attacked, and all of their books were burned and destroyed. And for 200 years, they were burning and destroying every copy that they could get of the New Testament. Consequently, most of the copies of the New Testament for the first 200 years were, in fact, destroyed. And so the manuscripts that we have, the first full manuscript of almost all the New Testament that we have is called Alexandrinus, and it was out of Alexandria in Egypt. And it's from about 300 AD. Now, I didn't look it up. I'm depending upon my memory. My memory is of a class I took about 1960. Okay, take it with a grain of salt. But somewhere in that neighborhood, about 300 AD, is this first full manuscript. Do we have any materials before that time? Yes, we do. And mostly they are fragmentary. They're short portions of a book. The very earliest manuscript of the New Testament we have was written on papyrus. All of the very earliest manuscripts were written on papyrus. And the very first one is, I think it's P47, the John Rylands manuscript. And it was a very small portion of the book of John, less than one page. of the book of John, just a few verses. But interestingly enough, that portion contained one of those readings which was distinctive to the Alexandrian type of text. Now we need to talk about text families here. Besides those old, and I'll get to that in a minute, besides those old copies of the Greek Bible, there were the writings of the church fathers. Various pastors of the churches at that time would write commentaries, they would write instructions, they would write theologies. We have a lot of those. As a matter of fact, we have so many of those where the pastors have written out in full in their writings some portion, a verse or two verses or a chapter or whatever of the New Testament, that you could reconstruct the entire New Testament just out of the writings of the church fathers. So it's abundant information. And then there were also early translations into other languages. Very early on, people who spoke the Syrian would want something in the Syrian language, and they have it in the Italian language, and they have it in all kinds of different languages. Well, that's not quite as good as having the Greek text, because then you're guessing a little bit. My Syriac text reads this way, and I think that might have been a translation from the Greek that said this. So you're guessing a little bit, but sometimes that's very helpful, because in a verse like we have in front of us in Revelation 13 verse 10, you'd be able to tell whether that was passive or active. You'd be able to tell whether it was written like it was the beast being warned that if you put people in prison, you're going to be put in prison, or on the other hand, if it was if you are put into prison, you're going to be put in prison. You could tell which one it was from a translation. You wouldn't have to have the exact Greek text to understand which of the text was being used there. So we have thousands of hand-copied Bibles, mostly written from 300 AD and later. Now, did I mention the date of that John Ryland's manuscript, the earliest that we have? About 150. Now, John was alive until about AD 97. So AD 150 was less than 60 years after John died. We've got a witness to part of what he wrote in that one. So it's not enough time for a lot of problems to have arisen. But these things are all written by hand. Okay? Printing press, when? About 1440. So until the printing press, they were sitting down and writing by hand. Now, even if you're just doing the New Testament, imagine yourself sitting down in some quiet place and writing very carefully, because you're making a copy of the Bible that somebody else is going to want to read. You want to make a very nice copy of the Bible, and you're writing, and you're doing this all day long, and you're doing it day after day after day, week after week after week, to get through the entire Bible. Now, you've got a copy you're working from. Okay, I'm making a copy of this, and you're writing over here. You're making your copy. Do you think they might have made a mistake by the time they got through? It's almost guaranteed. I mean, these are human beings. And so there are variations. You got to look at this manuscript and this manuscript and this manuscript from that time, and you see the variations. There are not a lot of them. They were extremely careful. They just weren't perfect. And so you have to try to come up, okay, now what was the original text? Sometimes a copier would make a mistake. Yours versus ours. in the New Testament is the difference between whether it's like a U or like an N, whether the loop is down or the loop is up. And it's not unusual to have that kind of a mistake, where a copyist was going along and, you know, maybe his mind is in mush by now, and he makes the wrong character and doesn't catch it. So there were mistakes that were made. Sometimes they were making corrections. Corrections. In other words, in their mind, they said, I know this isn't the way it goes. I'm going to put out a copy that's better than the one I'm copying from. I'm going to correct this. And they would make corrections. And then, in some manuscripts, there is somebody that's come along after the whole thing's been written, and in the margin, he's made a correction. Oh, it shouldn't have been that, it should have been this. And then you have manuscripts where that correction is marked out and a different correction is put in. And a third one, and a fourth one. So in the apparatus for the Greek New Testament, when you go through and study these things, it'll say, this is the first correction, or this is the original, a little star for the first one, the original, and a 1 for the first correction, a 2 for the second correction. Well, this is from Alexandrius. This is what our Alexandrius manuscript says, but it's the note that the second guy that made a correction put into it. That's the reading here. Am I snowing you yet? I'm not trying to snow you. But these are the kinds of things that the people that are trying to decide what the original text is have to deal with and have to make interpretations about. And then we have what I call the families of manuscripts. There, you can collect a group of manuscripts and say these manuscripts are basically the same text. No two exactly the same, but basically the same. Most of the time, when they have a reading that's different from a different family of texts, these agree. These all have you instead of we, or whatever the difference is. And so there is a family called Alexandrian or Alexandrius or something like that. There's another one that's called the Western text, which sounds geographical, but it doesn't have to be. It's just a text family. And then there's a Byzantine text family. So we got 3 different text families. And you're going through and you're trying to decide, okay, is the Alexandrian the original reading, or is the Western the original reading, or is the Byzantine the original reading? Or, in some case you might be working beyond that. One of these families, the Western text, is far more numerous, but later than the others. So where you might have scores of one, you might have thousands of this text. But it tended to be later copies, say 500 AD at the earliest, on through the printing press in 1440. So that's that family. We know it today. Sometimes a lot of people call it the majority text. Majority, more manuscripts read this way than any other way. Individual copies of the majority text have many readings which are distinctive to the majority text and different from the Alexandrian text. No 2 manuscripts of the majority text or any other text family are exactly the same. Now when I say there are no 2 that are exactly the same, you understand I'm saying very minor variations perhaps. You might have 2 manuscripts and I've never really studied this, but I'm guessing there might be, like 2 or 3 really minor mistakes that the scribe made when he was going through, so that the 2 are not quite the same. But still, there are no two that are, and how could there be? How could anybody sit down and copy it and never make one mistake all the way through? That's what you would expect to find. And scholars and teachers disagree as to how we should decide what is the original text. And here it gets a little bit more sticky. The scholar comes along and he says, I believe the oldest text is the original text. To me, it seems more reasonable that when changes were made, they were made later, not earlier. So somebody was working from this old text and he made this correction, or he made this change, or he made this mistake from this older, and the older one would be the original one. This is the line of reasoning of some people. Another line of reasoning is that the old ones are there because they weren't read much. The people of that time were looking for the best text, and they saw these and they said, well, I'm not going to use that, it's not accurate. So it didn't get worn out because people weren't using it. It got stored away in a library somewhere, and we have it as the oldest text that we have because it wasn't the best text. The best text was the one that they made a lot of copies of because they knew that was the best text, and that's the one that they were using. And then there's the argument that the Alexandrian text was tainted by the teachers of false doctrine. There were some people in the church in Alexandria that believed error. And they were in prominent positions. They say, we wouldn't appreciate anything that came out of Egypt because of these heretics that lived down there in Egypt. So they must have messed up the text, and therefore we can't trust these texts that come out, even though they're much older manuscripts than we have from somewhere else. So they've impugned them. And then they tend to impugn the folks that are working on figuring out which is the best text. Westcott and Hort were a couple of people who put out a copy of the Greek Testament, and they impugn their character and say they are not reliable, they were not godly people, and therefore we ought not to accept their work. Another thing they tend to do is say, we don't like the way the older text, the Alexandrian text, will sometimes have only Jesus or only Christ, where the majority text has the full name, Jesus Christ. They say somebody was trying to take away from the majesty and dignity of Jesus Christ, and they left one out just on purpose. They were just being ugly, and we prefer the text where it says Jesus Christ, not just Jesus or just Christ. They say that the Alexandrian text is not as careful with the deity of Christ as the other text. On the other hand, there are portions of the Alexandrian text which give a much stronger testimony to the deity of Christ than in the majority text. And they don't talk about those passages. Those don't fit the argument. So there are good people, I mean good people, who believe that the King James is the original. That's it. And
we fit some of them.
yeah, and they're good people, and they're working with a pure conscience to the best of their ability, and they've just either been taught differently or they've come to different conclusions, and you know, I'm fine with that. I don't like it when somebody says I have to come to their conclusion. I would rather use my own line of reasoning and what I feel is the direction of the Holy Spirit leading me. But it's not altogether simple. And I have read some of the commentaries of Mr. Westcott, and may I say I consider him a very godly man. What I have read from him has been just really terrific. And you know that I insist on purity of teaching in the Word. Okay. So, there's some Greek. Promised you I'd show you some Greek. There it is. Etis eis exmalosian, if anyone into captivity. That's the NA 27. That's what I've been calling the Alexandrian text. Not exactly, because it's the work of Nestle Aland. It's the 27th version of their work. Been working on it for a long time. Since then, there's been a 28th version, but I'm still working with the 27th version of Nestle Aland. And that is the text from which the NASB was translated. If anyone into captivity. Now, you look at that and you say, that doesn't have a verb. That doesn't have a verb. So, do you see what I've done here? This A here, now let's see, is this going to, you can't see my pointing. I'm supposed to do that. There it is. This A there is the if. Tis there is the anyone. Ace there is into, and this big long word here is captivity. So you have the Greek words in a quick, rough translation of each one side by side. And that's the text that you will find translated in the New American Standard. Now, the Textus Receptus could have been called the majority text. I'm not being technical here. Roughly speaking, the Textus Receptus could have been called the majority text, and it's the text from which the King James was translated. Different set of manuscripts that it was translated from. And that set of manuscripts is a little bit different. You can see the A is the same. Come on. There we go. I lifted my finger. I shouldn't have lifted my finger. There. A is the same as up here. Tis is the same as up here. But this one has ace, which this one does not have. And then after this word here, the spelling's a little bit different. You can see that at the end there. But it's basically the same thing. But then the Textus Receptus, or the majority text, has this sunage, which is the verb for leads. Now you look at that and you say, how do you suppose that happened? How did we get one whole family of manuscripts that said, if anyone into captivity, and another whole family of manuscripts that said, if anyone captivity leads? And you're trying to decide which one would be the original reading. Now, one of the factors I've already mentioned is the texts that are translated in the NASB are earlier. They're closer to the time of writing, okay? But there's another factor there. You say, which one of them is more likely to have given the translator the idea of making a change? Did the translator have a text that had a verb in it and say, this would be better without a verb? Or did the, I said translator, I didn't mean translator. I'm speaking of the person who is making the copy, the scribe who's making the copy. Or did he have a text that did not have a verb, if anyone into captivity, and did he say, this would be better if it had a verb in it? If anyone leads into captivity. Which way do you think he would make that change?
Probably put the leads in.
You would add the verb, wouldn't you? Because that would make it easier. And so one of the rules that these guys use when they're trying to figure out which is the original text is the one which is most likely to have led to the other one. If you can explain the other one by a transition in that direction, then probably you've found which one is the original text. The original text is probably harder than the copied or changed, altered text. Because these scribes were putting an awful lot of work into this, and they weren't trying to distort things. They were trying to give you as good a copy as you could get. They didn't have a printing press. They're going to write it out by hand, and so they're going to write what they think is the absolute best. And so I think that the top one is the original version. I think that's what was in the New Testament at the time that John wrote it. Atis eis exmalosion. Actually, I'm exmalosion, because that's where the accent has to be. I think that's the original one. Okay. Questions before I change to the next slide? I shouldn't ask that, should I? Here we're going on. And this is the other part of the same verse. If any by sword is to be killed, that's the NA 27, or that's the Alexandrian text. If any by sword is to be killed. You see the ace, if, tis. I'm pronouncing them that way, but you don't know the Greek alphabet, so are you able to go with, you able to follow that? Some of you are, okay. A, tis, n, those are all the same. A little bit of difference in the sword, mach ire versus mach ira. Not a lot of difference, it's still sword in either case. But a big difference between the apoktantheni and the apoktene. And it's the active is to be killed, I'm sorry, the active kills versus the passive is to be killed. But here we have a little reversal in what the versions have decided to do. When we were looking at the previous slide, we had the New American Standard taking from the NA 27, or the Alexandrian text. But when we come to this part of the verse, the New American Standard is taking it from the Textus Receptus instead of the NA 27. And they have the idea of any by sword kills. And so that complicates things a little bit for us. The English Standard Version, which normally, by the way, would be going with the majority text. It's supposed to be a modern translation of the same Greek manuscripts as the King James. But in this particular case, the English Standard Version has in fact thought that the Alexandrian was the original text. Holman, do you know by now where the Holman comes from? Holman Publishing is Southern Baptist. So this would be the Holman Christian Standard Bible. I think that's the way it's spelled out. I just put the Holman there. Is taking it from the older, or the Alexandrian, or the NA 27 text. But the King James and the NASB in this case have gone from the Textus Receptus, and they have taken if any by sword kills, versus the other, which is if any by sword is to be killed. So if you're the person, it makes a big difference. whether you're the person killing or the person who's going to be killed. But that's the difference that we have at this point in the text. Now, suppose I just do that. So, this verse is one of the more difficult ones that we have in the New Testament to decide. If you were to take all the places in the New Testament where we are not very confident that we know what the original text was, and collect them on one page, it would cover 1/2 of one page in the Greek New Testament. All of them that we don't know, where we have to say, yeah, I'm not sure of this or that. This is one of those passages. This is one where we just really cannot be, because the readings in the majority text appear more early than usual. It's not a lot of manuscripts early, but it is there, and if it's there, you know somebody had that reading in their Bible very early. And so that makes you think, okay, my argument about the earlier text isn't going to hold water here if the other one has a very early text also. Both of them very early. So you look at that, and then you say, well, from these manuscripts, I'm not sure which is which. So the primary basis for deciding what is the original text, the first evidence is, how old is the text? The second line of reasoning is the reasoning about whether or not it would have been changed that way, which is the more difficult reading, which is the shorter reading, and so forth. There are 5 different canons, 5 different rules that are used in making that kind of a decision as to which is more likely to be the original text. A.T. Robertson, the Greek expert, says this text here is very uncertain. But you know what? When all is said and done, whether you use the majority text or whether you use the Alexandrian text or you use the Byzantine text, your doctrinal statement would be exactly the same in every case all the way through, except for one thing. The one thing where it would not be the same is if you are a snake handler. And there's a passage in Mark that's not in the earliest manuscripts, which says, they shall take up snakes. That's not Paul being bitten. He wasn't taking up that snake. He was attacked by that snake. Yeah. But if you're a snake handler who takes up snakes, then you've got good authority from the majority text. You don't have good authority from the Alexandrian text. So we're not going to decide which is the right text based upon whether or not we want to handle snakes. No, but I agree with you. I don't want to. But if that were the correct reading, my not wanting to wouldn't make any difference. You know, you've got to go with whatever God said. So, but I'm pretty sure God didn't write that we were supposed to take up snakes, even though the majority text says that. Okay, back to our text. The passive says, is destined for captivity. And that comes from earlier manuscripts and fits the context better. It addresses the saints, and these verses 9 and 10 are addressed to the saints. Here's perseverance, perseverance of the saints. And they are not in a position to be putting anyone into captivity. You're looking at the flow of thought in this thing, and you see the Christians being told the beast is going to have authority over the whole world. And he's going to have authority over the saints, and he's going to have victory over the saints, and he's going to kill them, and he's going to put them into prison. Well, at that point, you're not going to be warning the saints you shouldn't be putting people in prison. It's not going to be about that. If you're talking to the saints, what's your message to them in that context? If anybody's going to be put into prison, he will be put into prison. Expect it. So the saints will be victims put into captivity, and that's what the first part of the verse is saying. The second half of the verse in the New American Standard reads, if anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Now remember, the New American Standard at this point has gone with the majority text, or the later text. If you ask me why, I can't give you an answer. I don't know why they decided to do that. And the textual evidence is really tough to follow. But it warns against killing. The Holman Christian Standard reads, if anyone is to be killed with a sword he will be killed. That's what fits the context. And that was taken from the older manuscripts, which I think are the original, are closer to the original. The English Standard Version reads, if anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. So again, you have the same manuscript, slightly different way of translating. One says if anyone is to be killed, the other says if anyone is to be slain. But it's the same message, fits the context in the same way, prepares the saints to persevere. So the beast out of the sea comes out of the abyss. He has 7 heads, which are historic, present, and future kingdoms. There are kingdoms at different times, not the same time. He has 10 horns, and those are all end-time nations and powers. He was like a leopard, a bear, and a lion. And these were the characteristics that Daniel saw of the ancient kingdoms closer to his time. The mark of the beast is being of the same nature. I'm not talking about the 666. They mark the beast, these features, leopard, bear, and lion, they mark the beast as being of the same nature as the rulers of all of the ages. These secular rulers have been of the same nature. They've been like leopards, they've been like bears, they've been like lions. And this beast at the end is like all 3 of them. He gets his power, authority, and throne from Satan. One of his heads, that is the ruler of one age, we would think the last age, is apparently wounded fatally. But the wound is healed, and that leads the whole world to worship him. He came back to life. This is the real deal. You got to believe. That's theirs. This beast is arrogant, blasphemous, but he just has 42 months to act. He blasphemes heaven, he blasphemes the angels, and at the end the saints are prepared to be thrown into prison and to be killed and to persevere. Next time, Lord willing, we'll pick up with a third beastly creature. First one wasn't called a beast, he was called a dragon. That was Satan. We've just completed looking at the second beast, who is the Antichrist. And next time, Lord willing, we'll look at the third beast, who is the false prophet.